Shabbat Shalom. The way the story goes is that the year was 1948, and Israel had just won its war of independence, and a permanent draft was mandated for all Israeli men at the age of 18. But David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, was approached by Yitzhak Meir Levin, one of his closest allies. Levin was a man of significant influence, one of the 37 signatories to Israel's Declaration of Independence, and he would be the first political head of the first Haredi party. He begged Ben-Gurion to behold the shattered remnant of Eastern Europe's Orthodox Haredim. They were only now finding their way out of the DP camps and towards haven in the newly open land of Israel. Levin's request was a simple one: exempt his 400 best and brightest Torah scholars from the draft. Let them study Torah instead as their sole and only occupation. They would take on no other job in society. And let this remnant of the old way, the Eastern European way, stay alive just a little while longer. In the shadow of the Shoah, and with the establishment of this deeply secular yet Jewish state, it appeared to both Ben-Gurion and Levin that the Haredi way of life would soon be extinct. And Ben-Gurion, whether out of pity or political acumen, accepted this deal, and the Torato Emunato was born. Torato Emunato, a phrase drawn from our Talmud Bavli, Shabbat 11a, recalls that rare among even the rabbis of the Talmud, there was a great sage by the name Shimon Bar Yochai. And Shimon Bar Yochai's only profession was the study of Torah. He and his friends were the Toratan Emunatan. They were a rarity in ancient Israel, and these 400 men would be a rarity in modern Israel. So goes the story. The Haredi way of life, of course, did not die out. It has grown exponentially in Israel and the diaspora, and as the number has grown, so too has the exemption from military service, first from 400 to 800 in the late 1960s following the Six-Day War, and then from 800 to the entire Haredi male population in 1977. In the following decades, Haredi political power, status quo inertia, and the IDF's own ambivalence towards finding a way to include the ultra-Orthodox enshrined this policy. The lack of ultra-Orthodox service in the IDF remained one of Israel's great unsolvable problems, eternally kicked down the road. Certainly, it bothered the Chiloni Jews, and the Da'ati Le'umi Jews, and the Mizrahi Jews, and the Masorti Jews, and the Reform Jews, and not to be confused with the Jews, also the Druze. Each of the groups who see their mandatory military service as the both great and awesome, terrible honor, which is needed for the defense of the state. But what could be done about it? Politicians, judges, they made attempts, but political pressures always returned Israel to its status quo of Haredi exemption. In 2017, there was a bump in the road. The Israeli Supreme Court officially ruled that the draft exemption for Haredim was discriminatory and charged the government with ending that Haredi draft exemption. But the government did nothing because, well, yes, the law was discriminatory, it was still the law. And it would not expire for another 5 years. And in 2023, when that initial exemption law finally expired, the government had a plan in place. The Haredi draft issue would be solved as part of the judicial overhaul. Haredi parties pushed for a new basic law which would equate Torah study to military service, making the status quo of Haredi draft exemption into Haredi draft immunity. And without a strong judiciary, and without the outpouring of resistance against the judicial coup, that is the outcome we would have seen last summer. But between the protests of 2023 and the terrible outbreak of war on October 7th, this current government in Israel has been unable to create a framework that will enshrine Haredi draft exemption. And 10 months later, after the extension of this law came and went, this week the High Court and the Attorney General ordered the government to begin drafting Haredi men into the IDF and officially barred the funding of yeshivot, the religious study houses for those who would go and study instead of performing their national service. Today in Israel, there are approximately 63,000 Haredi men of fighting age, and there is an expectation that this year, 3,000 of them will join the IDF, which does not include the small but very worthy of mention and praise, roughly 1,800 Haredi men who join the IDF every year of their own free will. We will return to modern Israel in just a moment, but let's go now to the Israel in our Torah. I will just share personally that it is one of the core elements of my faith that when we take the time to look, Torah speaks to us in perfect symmetrical harmony. And therefore, I am not surprised in the least that this week's Torah portion is Shlach Lecha. What other Torah portion could it possibly be than Shlach Lecha, after all? It is the story of the 12 spies, the story of Israel's first true military service, the story of communal responsibility for the good and for the bad. What else could be more fitting as we address this moment which has been brewing in Jewish culture and history for 75 years? In Shlach Lecha, the 12 spies, one from each tribe, are sent out, selected by Moses, one might even say drafted, to go into the land, determine what kind of military resistance the Israelites can expect as they reconquer. And you know this story. They return. 10 of them bring a negative report, but 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, bring a hopeful charge. We must go up, they say. But the Israelites believe the 10. They beg to return to Egypt. They doom their entire generation to die in the wilderness. Like I said, you know this story. You know that each tribe sends a spy, but actually, that's not true. Yes, 12 men representing 12 tribes do go into the land of Israel, and they are from Reuven and Shimeon, from Judah and Yisachar, from Ephraim and Benjamin, from Zevulun and Menashe, from Dan and from Asher, from Naphtali and from Gad. But did you catch the one that is missing? The Levites, the priests, the religious leaders of Israel who are supposed to spend their lives in service of the temple do not go into the military. They do not send a spy. And our rabbis, led by the Chizkuni, say that because the Levites do not have any claim to any land in the land of Israel, they do not need to send a spy, but instead, Hoshea ben Nun, who is Joshua, Moses' right-hand man and successor, replaces them. According to Midrash, he is the volunteer, the sole volunteer amongst the 12 spies, which is what warrants his name change from Hosea to Yehoshua. God will save you. God will save you from the wicked counsel of these other 10 men. Yes, the rabbis argue the Levites were exempt from service, but they also offer a tochacha, a rebuke. Joshua takes their place, and what happens to him? He becomes the leader. He shows that he is worthy of blessing. Joshua survives the wilderness and leads our people into the land because he went on a mission he did not have to. If he stayed behind, the Midrash states, he would have died like everyone else. And we rabbinic Jews do not view ourselves as the spiritual descendants of Levites. We view ourselves as the spiritual descendants of Joshua, the kind of Jew who lives the mitzvot in the world and takes responsibility for the world around us. And perhaps, were I a different kind of rabbi, in a different kind of black suit, I would argue that Torah is also speaking to me in this moment. And I would see and argue quite loudly that those who serve God have always been exempt from military service, which is a common rabbinic teaching that is explicitly drawn from this very text. Or perhaps I would tell you that those who serve God should avoid the company of evil men, and that the ancient Israelites, and specifically the ancient Levites, were very wise not to send a spy. Because, well, yes, they didn't go in, they also weren't responsible for 40 years in the wilderness. We may see ourselves speaking with the Torah in perfectly timed symmetry, but we're not the only Jews reading this Torah this morning and see as it plays out within our national story. So it should not surprise you then, as we return to modern Israel, that the overturning of the Haredi draft exemption has not been met quietly by the ultra-Orthodox. Their newspapers and their leadership this week raged against the state, threatened to quit the government, and condemned the nation for attempting to destroy the very Torah itself. War is declared upon the Torah world, says one. To draft the Haredim is to force us to transgress our Torah, says another. A leading Haredi rabbi called out and said, "A sword hangs above the Beit Midrash. Dear brothers, save us, for those who act with hate and anger and wickedness and malice have come to destroy the Torah." And there is an ongoing resistance being organized against the draft. It was corroborated in Haaretz this week that senior rabbis have successfully returned from the United States with over $100 million of funding to keep those yeshivot that will be defunded funded. And a mass protest on the highways and roads of Bnei Brak caused traffic delays for an entire day and the arrest of 32 ultra-Orthodox protesters. And Haredi rabbis have argued that prison and exodus from the state, even perhaps death, would be preferable to service in the IDF, which is quite a statement, considering that the IDF has openly stated that this will be a slow process, and that forced enlistment, that kind of Cossack-like vision that the Haredi have of the IDF bursting into the yeshivot and detaining and arresting their young men and shaving their heads and putting them into the IDF, is just not what's going to happen. One source states that the IDF is considering placing these new ultra-Orthodox soldiers in what is often considered the safest possible location, the Jordanian border. And there they will get accustomed to their service with a base that has a rabbi and very strict kashrut. And of course, absolutely 100% no women. And even the ministers of our current government, who would like nothing more than for this problem to just return to its status quo, are struggling to restore order. Edelstein, the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee chairman, has been privately dressed down several times by Netanyahu this week alone for trying to rewrite the draft law in a way that might find broad consensus, because any wrong move he takes will cause the coalition to fall once the Haredi parties leave. And the fact that he's having a hard time writing this bill brings up another fundamental issue, which is that, well, yes, Likud voters and politicians want to be in power, but they don't themselves want to continue to fund and defend the Haredi way of life when it's their children and their grandchildren who are serving in Gaza. And God defend us, God protect us, will soon face a new front in the north against Hezbollah. Indeed, Israeli voters on right and left alike have long felt taken advantage by the Haredim, and their elected officials have been often criticized for their willingness to play ball. David Horowitz, the editor of the Times of Israel, wrote this week, in contrast to the centuries of Orthodox Jewish tradition, in contrast to the abiding norm in Jewish communities around the world, it is only in Israel, and only in the past half-century, that full-time Torah study for young male Haredi masses has become the norm. It is an aberration that is indulged by secular politicians in exchange for alliances with the leadership of this ever-growing ultra-Orthodox community. So what comes next? Is this just the brief rattle before we return to that status quo? Or is this the unexpected demolition of what many believe to be an unshakable coalition? Is this, God forbid, yet another break in the foundation of Israeli society? Or is this the moment that we actually see one of Israel's great unsolvable issues actually start to get resolved? No one knows. But in situations like this, we do what Jews have always done throughout our history, and we look to the Parsha. We look to the Torah. And in our Parsha this week, Bamidbar 13, verse 30, the 10 spies go and give their damning report, but Caleb is unshaken. He stands his ground. Let us go up. Ole na'aleh. We must go up. And then he continues and he says, we must overcome this difficulty. Ki yachol nuchala. And you can read between the lines, he has heard what those 10 spies have to say. He believes that they might even have an element of truth in what they say. He knows it will be hard. He knows it will be a challenge. He knows it will be scary. And he still insists that we try. For too long, Israelis and Jews worldwide have accepted that we cannot fix this problem. That the issue of service of the Haredi in the IDF, indeed of Haredi participation in greater Israeli society, was too much. The sacrifice needed to do some kind of reform on this was going to be too costly for whatever government did it. That the need for the Haredi to actually participate in society was too low. And for too long, we listened to the voices that made acceptable compromises for today instead of thinking about tomorrow. But the Torah speaks. In the face of impossible choice, impossible challenge, in the presence of being told that a goal, a situation is impossible, unfixable, not for this moment, we and our Israeli brothers and sisters, right and left, need to listen to the voice of Caleb calling out to us from the Torah over the course of millennia. Ole na'aleh. We must go up. We must support our Israeli friends, our Israeli family, our vital NGOs, our Reform congregations who have been fighting for equality on this subject for decades. And we must even support those who we bitterly disagree with on so many other issues, but here we are aligned as they navigate what seems to be an impossible challenge. No one knows yet how to solve this problem in Israel. But it is only an impossible problem if we and they do not try. We all know the story. We all know the story of what happens when our people do not try. We have read it again. We know that there is only a wilderness before us if we listen to defeatism and refuse to try. If we look at our beloved Israel and accept it only as it is, instead of what it can still be. Ole na'aleh. This time, let us go up. Shabbat shalom.